The woman has said we're going.
Well, I want to welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is John Reiskind, and I'm this year's president of the Florida Free Speech Forum. Welcome to the March 14th meeting of the Florida Free Speech Forum. We are so glad you have joined us by Zoom. We ask all of you to make sure that your microphones are muted until the Q&A. We meet the second Monday of each month, September through May, with presentations at noon. Our forum does not endorse candidates nor take sides on issues other than the critical issue of exercising our right to free speech. And to that mission, we are committed with a passion. Our guest speakers will share with us their knowledge for about a half an hour or so, 40 minutes, after which we have time to ask questions. You may type your questions in the chat column during the presentation, which I will present to the speaker at the end of it, or ask them yourself. It is the responsibility of all of us to be respectful of our guests and to all questioners. We ask that questioners not endorse particular candidates or issues, simply ask questions that can help us all to learn more about our speaker and our topic. This month, our speaker is Dr. Michelle Jacobs. Michelle Jacobs comes from today from Washington. Michelle Jacobs is an Emeritus professor, having just retired from 28 years as a professor of law at the University of Florida's College of Law, and was the racial justice term professor for the 2020-2021 last academic year. She received her BA from Princeton University and a Juris Doctor from Rutgers University. She taught criminal law, criminal procedure, white-collar crime, international criminal law, and critical race theory. Before joining the University of Florida, Professor Jacobs was an experienced trial lawyer. She represented union workers in District Council 37, which is New York City's largest public sector employee union, and then went on to represent plaintiffs in federal civil rights litigation under the Fair Housing Act 42 USC 3601 and following. After transitioning her practice to criminal defense, she represented defendants in federal cases in the Southern District of New York and in the state courts of New York and New Jersey. And there's some interesting cases there today, but she's not representing anybody this time, I don't think. Professor Jacobs' scholarship focuses on access to justice for communities marginalized in and by the law. Today, Professor Jacobs will be speaking to us on, does the attack on critical race theory reflect a two-tiered right to free speech? Welcome, Professor Jacobs.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And wow, you did some research because that's not the bio I sent you. But before we get started, I think you all know from Zoom experience that the tiles on the screen jump around. So they're not always in the same place. And I just see two people that I have to say hello to, which is my former colleague, Joseph Little, and Horace Moore Sr. is somewhere here, but his picture jumped off. So I want to give a special hello to those two. So thank you for inviting me to speak to the Florida Free Speech Forum regarding the legislative and political attacks on the so-called critical race theory. I'm going to do a couple of things this afternoon that I always do when I talk about critical race theory, but in particular, I want to add some extra stuff for you guys on the free speech stuff. Because when Professor Paul Hargrave asked me if I would speak, the first time, of course, it wasn't virtual and I couldn't come down to Florida. But the second time he asked, I said I would do it. And then he asked me if I would tweak the speech a little to include a discussion of some principles of free speech. And I'm sir? Okay, we're good. I'm certain that his query was made to make sure my talk was relevant to those of you who are primarily—
It was unclear. I didn't absolutely need to go, but it was helpful. So.
Okay, hello.
Nice.
All right. So
Okay.
his query was to make sure
I had the
my,
wrong phone number. That was one reason.
okay, whoever that is, you should mute your mic.
How are you?
I'm fine. I just woke up.
That's Rick Gold.
Good.
Okay. Could
Oh,
he,
yeah.
can he mute?
Good.
Could someone send him a chat
Mhm.
message to mute?
Finland, Pilsmäntö Park. Bak. Listet.
John, can you mute him?
All right. So, okay. So let me get back to where I was. So he'd asked me to tweak the speech to talk about First Amendment rights. And it occurred to me that the question itself highlighted for me the ways in which lawyers, jurists, academics, and others interested in constitutional rights separate the protection of rights you believe you are entitled to the rights of non-white Americans. Because at its heart, the attack on critical race theory is an attack on free speech. But of course, in order to recognize that, there has to be an underlying belief that non-white Americans also have the same First Amendment rights to speech as white Americans. Historically, the protection for the right of non-white Americans to speak has not been treated with the same gravitas as when the law is talking about protecting the rights of white speech, even when that speech offends or terrorizes Black and brown people. Therefore, free speech advocates can rally around, for example, Joe Rogan, in the controversy recently at Spotify, who says the N-word 110 times over the course of a series of podcasts. But that those same free speech advocates rarely rally around folks of color who are expressing free speech. So I'll give you just a quick example. Recently, last semester at the University of California, some students walked around in blackface, and the Black students objected, but the university said, no, that was their right to free speech. 1 week later, a Muslim American professor said that Barbara Bush was racist, and he was subjected to punitive action by the university because his speech was not acceptable. And though the ACLU often comes out in support of the Klan and Nazis and so forth, and other white supremacists who speak because they have the right to free speech, you can look through the history of the ACLU, and they have rarely, if ever, come out to speak on behalf of Black extremists such as the Nation of Islam or Minister Farrakhan. So this idea, even amongst the free speech experts, that non-whites have the same freedom of speech is somewhat shaky. All right, so we're gonna start, just, I'm not a con law expert or a free speech expert, but just to give you a couple of principles of it's an attack on free speech, which probably any first-year law student could look up for you. When we're evaluating a First Amendment protection case to see whether free speech is being impinged, we're looking at the restrictive legislation in terms of, is it regulating time, place, and manner of speech? Restrictions that are content neutral, narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and which leave open ample alternative channels for communicating the speaker's message are permissible. The Florida legislation, however, on critical race theory violates all three prongs. It is content specific in that it restricts speech on race. And it's far from narrowly tailored. In fact, it's so wildly and vague. It's so wild and vague and broad reaching that you really can't tell what the legislation is attempting to regulate. And they offer no alternative channels as the Supreme Court has required. I find that most non-law academics and even many law professors do not know what critical race theory is, although everyone has an opinion on what it is. And voters are being galvanized to vote against something they don't even understand. So before we start, I'm going to show you a clip of an interview with a voter in Virginia from the last election cycle when the Republican candidate Youngkin was running for governor in Virginia. And he ran on the platform that if he was elected, he would ban critical race theory teaching in K through 12. Now, of course, this is despite the fact that all the educators in Virginia said there is no critical race theory teaching in K through 12. But nonetheless, this was a significant issue in his campaign. And I just want to give you a little, the clip is very short, but I'm going to show you a little clip of what a voter in I'll get it up for you. You don't want my UF stuff, you want my Twitter. Okay. So let me see. Let me know if you cannot hear the video. Can you hear that?
You can't hear it.
You can't hear it. Okay.
No.
Okay. There's that little button on the
Oh, yeah. We now have this subtitles.
You have the subtitles? Okay,
We
that's good. That could work. That can work. That's fine. So for those of you who may
Now
not be
we
able
can't
to
see it.
now you can't see it, right? Because I didn't share. Okay.
It's okay.
You gotta love it. Okay, get back to share. Yeah, all right, here we go. So the reporter is asking him, what's the most important issue in the governor's race here in Virginia? And as you can see from subtitles, he's saying getting back to the basics of teaching education, not teaching them critical race theory. And what is critical race theory? I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because I don't understand it that much, but it's something that and he's stuttering through this, with little bit, I don't know, I don't care for. And what have you heard that you don't like? I'm not going to, I don't have that much knowledge on it, but it's something that I don't care for. So that's basically what people know about critical race theory. They don't know anything about it. So before I engage in any discussion with people on critical race theory, it's imperative that you know what it is so that you can ask me questions that are intelligently formed, all right? And I'm happy to answer any question, but you have to be educated on what you're talking about first. So just sit back. I'm going to go through my 15 or 20 minutes on what critical race theory is so that you understand what we're talking about. The clip that I showed is a perfect example of an undereducated voter who has been manipulated by politicians. The candidate he voted for ran on a promise to eliminate CRT in schools. He won and immediately issued an executive order banning the teaching of CRT in schools. Recently, a letter was submitted by the superintendents of schools in the entire state to object to the governor's plan to establish a new policy regarding the teaching of race. Every single superintendent in the state signed the letter objecting to the governor's plans, and they issued an announcement that after an exhaustive review, no critical race theory is being taught in the Virginia schools. But of course, that doesn't change the governor's propaganda on what he's doing. So my main task to you today is to explain what critical race theory is and to give you some examples of how even free speech advocates view their rights as separate from the parents, children, and communities that are having their rights trampled upon by these legislative initiatives. So here we go with the law stuff. Critical race theory is one of 5 modern jurisprudential approaches to analyzing law. Jurisprudence is the philosophy of law. And throughout history, legal scholars, academics, general philosophers have engaged in debate about how law should be interpreted and applied. All philosophies, including the critical ones, have a lens or a focal point through which they use to interpret the law. In the late 70s and 80s, the legal environment was forced to expand because this is when women and lawyers of color began to come into the profession in numbers. And so our voices were added to the voices of what were previously just white men interpreting the law. The first 3 expansions of critical theory were critical legal studies, feminist legal theory, and critical race theory. Today, not that many people are familiar with critical legal studies. You have to be of a certain age to really appreciate what that was. And it was where a group of scholars used economics and tried to look at socialism and Marxism and to see how any of those economic ideas impacted the interpretation of law. Feminist legal theory, we should all know, uses the lens of gender to look at the law in terms of how it was developed and how it was applied and how it should be developed in the future. And of course, critical race theory uses the lens of race. All three are considered critical analysis because they challenge the commonly held understanding of how law develops, what it means, and how it is applied. Today, there are two additional critical theories, lat crit, which uses language and ethnicity as a lens, and queer theory that focuses on the impact of gender identity.
She's much better, yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Well, I'm supposed to make an appointment
Mute.
to have her.
Please mute
um,
whoever is talking.
The original plan was to go and get some shots.
Jane, Jane, please mute.
Oh, gosh. I thought I was. I'm very sorry.
It's okay.
Okay.
All right. So where are we? We're picking up with the five critical theories and how they using to look at the law. There came a time in legal development where particularly in the 1960s and early 70s, where law developed, embraced the language that came out of an 1896 case called Plessy versus Ferguson. For those of you who don't remember it, Plessy versus Ferguson was the case where the Supreme Court upheld de jure racial segregation. De jure just means, enacted by law. So that was the case where separate but equal was stamped and burned and approved into the law by the United States Supreme Court. In that opinion, Justice Harlan, who dissented from the majority, saying that separate but equal should not be maintained, used an expression called colorblind. And in his mind, there were certain areas of the law. He didn't believe this for all the law, but in certain areas of the law, the language of the law should make no distinction based on race or color. And that was 1896. When the civil rights legislation got passed and de jure segregation was finally eliminated, the court started picking up on the use of this colorblind language, right? So for our purposes, the phrase colorblind is used to convey the idea that race or color is not a consideration in the enactment or application of the law. In other words, that the law is neutral and sees and treats everyone the same. This is how law is taught today in almost all law schools. Critical race theory contradicts the colorblind theory. Our scholars study the enactment and application of law from colonial times through to the present. It asks where and how was race or color expressly used in the law to exclude Africans from protection of law, and then to deny African Americans, Mexicans, indigenous people, and Asians the same rights that have been extended or granted to whites. Many white Americans believe that de jure, enforced by law, exclusion and denial of rights ended at the conclusion of civil war. But this is a mistaken belief. De jure exclusion continued unabated despite the end of the Civil War, right on through to the late 1960s. So in addition to studying the history and development of the law, critical race scholars also look at the institutions that were built to regulate society during the 300+ years where law was specifically denying rights based on race or color. Today, we say that racism in law is de facto, right? As opposed to de jure. The word race was struck from the law. So technically, racial denials can no longer be based on race or color, but it still exists de facto. And that happens because the practices and cultural beliefs remain firmly in place today. And they exist through the institutions that were built when race was the basis for discrimination, de jure, that were never dismantled. It's the role of the critical race theory scholar to draw the thread or connect the dots, if you will, between the racial discrimination that happens today and the systems of discrimination that were built over the 300+ years of de jure denial of rights, the institutions that were never dismantled. Critical race theory scholars do not make up their source material, right? We study the actual laws that were enacted in the colonies. We study the development of the language chosen for the Constitution, and we follow the debates of the framers around what should and shouldn't have been included in the Constitution and then in the Bill of Rights. We study Supreme Court opinions and state legislation and state constitutions. We study the records from the US Army and other military units. We study treaties and covenants. We study administrative decisions. In sum, we study American legal history, all of it, not just the shiny parts. CRT is being intentionally misrepresented and in some cases confused or conflated with teaching the racial aspects of American history. That is the history of this country that includes all people, not just the ones who came here from England. For older people in the room, you may remember that this material used to come under the category of ethnic studies, right? And it's where you learned about African American history, Native American history, Asian Americans, Hispanic or Latinx history, because our histories were also American histories, but not taught at that time under the rubric of general American history. So let me, let's see if this will work. I'm gonna put my little slideshow up for you so that you can have some other stuff to look at beside me. Okay, so you may remember that recently, I think this last fall, Rick Santorum gave a speech where he said that our country was birthed out of nothing. There was nothing here before the colonists came, and the Indians had not done anything here. Well, that was not true, right? Because there were 25 million indigenous people here, and some of their civilizations were thousands of years old. So of course they had done quite a bit before anyone from England reached these shores. Think how different Santorum's understanding of history would be if he was taught, for example, that the governing principles that underlie our own separation of powers theory came from the Iroquois Confederacy, a collection of 5 Native American nations whose governmental organization, before they ever became exposed to Europeans, used this principle of separation of powers. And it inspired the framers to adopt that idea into the formation of our own Constitution. So yes, American history should include learning Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, but it should also include the teaching about Native American people and the intentional destruction of their civilizations. It should teach that slavery fueled the economic development of the European states. That is a historical fact. Students should learn about how Mexico extended up to what is now Kansas and over to California. It would help them understand that Mexicans have always been here, and it is we who crossed the border. But this is the history that people are afraid of, right? Critical race theory has become a code word for any teaching of American history that mentions race. But as you can see from these little examples I just gave of the Native Americans, of the Mexicans being here, of slavery, that has nothing to do with the jurisprudential philosophy of critical race theory, right? It is simply the teaching of American history. Now, as a critical race scholar, we can help support people who are teaching American history, and this is how we can do it. This is a book, a history book for Virginia that used to be used in the schools up into the late 1970s. And in this chapter, chapter 29, they're explaining how slavery worked in Virginia. And according to the book, it was very lovely. The slaves, the enslaved people and the people who owned the plantations had a mutually beneficial working relationship. Slaves were allowed to read, to have guns, to gather and travel as they please. All right, we're not going to teach the unit. The critical race theory scholars are not going to teach the unit on Virginia history in the 1970s. But because we study law, we can provide teachers with a copy of the laws of Virginia from 1786, which lay out specifically that Black people could not gather in more groups of more than 2 or 3, or they would be arrested. They were not permitted to own weapons. They were not permitted to read. And there was a punishment for learning how to read, both for the enslaved person as well as for the white person who taught them how to read. So this is what critical race theory adds to the discussion. We can provide the supporting legal documents that contradict the fantasies that were taught in many American law schools. And I bring up this example specifically because this attempt to Disneyfy slavery is still going on today. And every year in some school district across the country, parents have to complain, Black parents have to complain about some new textbook in their children's curriculum that is trying to paint this lovely little picture of enslavement, as you see here in the Virginia text. So that's how critical race theorists can help. We are not actually teaching K through 12, but if a K through 12 teacher needs the documents that came from out of law, that we can do. We can provide them with a copy of the Code of Virginia from 1786. We're not going to teach critical race theory in the 7th grade Virginia history class, but we can help the teacher with resources. So that's how that piece fits together. The attack on critical race theory, as well as any discussion of race and race-related issues, is a direct response to the progress made as a result of the social justice protests that began in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. For the first time since the civil rights era, since the 60s and the 70s, we saw a broad-based multiracial participation across the nation to address issues of racism, poverty, and inequality. The widespread movement towards change upsets those who benefit from keeping non-white people under economic, legal, and social oppression. So the attack on what is being bandied about as critical race theory is really an effort to silence those advocates for change who are challenging the status quo. And they try to create fear among those who want to support those advocates. And this attempt to create fear, to talk about change, also has the secondary effect of suppressing the contributions made by Black and Brown people to the development of this country when the development of the country is being taught in K through 12. The idea that critical race theory is taught in K through 12 is a straw man argument that was developed. And again, I'm just, you can all Google this. This is a factual, this is a fact that this is not my opinion, but it is a fact. The argument that CRT was developed, taught in K through 12 was developed by Charles Koch Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, and other conservative think tanks expressly for the purposes of raising fear and panic in the white population that believes in something called replacement theory. Now, replacement theory used to be restricted to the conspiracy theorist community, right? You didn't usually hear it outside of that. But the replacement theory basically is that the white extremist belief that low birth rates among whites is going to lead to a greater number of brown people replacing whites. So their analysis of the growth of any Black population is what we call a zero-sum game analysis, so that if someone gets something, someone else has to lose something in order for that person to get something. You might already be familiar with the replacement theory because it's actually what some extremist white Christians have been arguing for quite some while about Jewish people. So you're going to see the connection between the attack on race and the attack on anyone who has a belief that's different from you. So the replacement theory originally came about when Christians were arguing that Jews were going to replace them, right? And if you remember the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, I hope all of you will remember that, which eventually led to the death of Heather Meyer when she was killed when a member of the Unite the Right group drove his car through the crowd and she was struck and killed. But that group, Unite the Right, the night before Heather Meyer was killed, marched on UVA's campus with the tiki torches. And they were being led by Richard Spencer, who was shouting, "Jews will not replace us," right? This is replacement theory. He wasn't talking about blacks will not replace us. He was saying Jews will not replace us because that was the original bad guy in the replacement theory. So, as I said, replacement theory used to be a theory that was endorsed by a very small extremist group of people, white supremacists and folks like them. But it jumped into the regular community discussion when our former president came into office, and he repeated it, and his supporters frequently repeated it, and it has been recently promoted by Tucker Carlson and Newt Gingrich. So CRT is like a dog whistle for them. And even though the politicians who use CRT as a bludgeoning tool cannot themselves define it, if you go back and look at those videos of DeSantis when he's explaining why he's banning critical race theory in K through 12, you can tell he doesn't understand what he's talking about. He doesn't have a full understanding of what critical race theory is, nor did former Vice President Pence when he gets up at the conservative meetings and he explains how critical race theory is teaching hate. You don't even talk about hate in critical race theory. We're talking about law. That's what we talk about in critical race theory. But that kind of fear mongering allows the voters who are uneducated to actually become afraid of the teaching of something that they don't understand. So I want to talk about now this recent controversy, not only in Florida, but around the country, where people, where parents are being told that where parents are afraid of what their children are being taught in school. And somehow or another, if they taught a fuller version of American history, they think their child will be hated or feel bad about themselves. This fear lives in people who don't really believe in the promise of the dream of America. They say they do. They wrap themselves in flags and tattoo the word patriots on themselves. But in reality, they don't believe in the dream, because the American dream is that everyone who comes here brings something good to the table and enriches the whole community. But for people who do not really believe the dream, again, it's a zero-sum game. If someone brings their piece to the table, then there won't be room for my piece. This is the thinking of an oppressor group, because inclusion is not zero-sum game. And what people who have been excluded from American history for all this time are saying, let's get a bigger table so that everyone's piece can fit. I highly recommend that you read Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, which details the economic losses everyone in America suffers as a result of racism and decisions based on that zero-sum game analysis. It's really a wonderful book. So in my opinion, American children would be enriched and feel better about themselves if they understood the more complex American history. They would learn that our heroes are people who are not infallible. They can learn that running a government, making laws, and protecting people is complicated. And sometimes our leaders get it right and sometimes they don't. Bad things can happen when you make a mistake, but then there are lessons to be learned about how to fix errors that you make. They can learn that running a government is hard. It's not just standing up and saying a slogan over and over. These are important lessons for our children. And that doesn't even begin to touch on how much more fun it would be to learn history if we included more of ourselves in it. Some of you can think back to your days in history class and wonder whether you were awake during most of it. Our children are not fragile and they don't start off ignorant. We've made them that way. So let's stop doing that. When the media talks about critical race theory, they show pictures of parents arguing and fighting against their school boards, alleging that the schools are teaching critical race theory. And they have to fight to protect their children. So let's take a look at the media's representation of parents. Did you notice anything about the parents?
They're young. Whoop. They're old.
Some of them are, but they're all white, right? And the children that need to be protected are white. Now, I will say, in all of these discussions, there has been one Black parent that has been profiled as being anti-CRT. She is in a mixed race marriage, and she parrots the language that CRT is teaching hate, which again shows that she's part of the crew that is being manipulated by this agenda and doesn't really actually understand what CRT is. But in all of that, you have to ask yourself, where are the Black parents in Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, and the other states where the teaching of race is being restricted? Why aren't they in the news? And why aren't their voices being heard? So I just want to let you know that the Black parents are out there and they're fighting for their children as well. So this is a family from Plano, Texas. And they had the courage to go to the school board meeting where the white parents were getting riled up and being instructed about critical race theory. And the parents say in their interview that there was actually someone at the meeting who was going around and instructing the parents what critical race theory was and how to look for it. And it gets hidden, kept saying they hide it under diversity and equity initiatives. So you have to be very careful because they will stick it into everything. So these two parents yelled out, "Who is they? Who is they?" And immediately the crowd turned on them. A gentleman who was sitting a few rows ahead of them yelled, "We're not here to listen to you. Shut the F up." So much for the free speech of Black parents, right? And how hypocritical is that, right? You're holding up a sign that says we won't be silenced. And when somebody speaks up in opposition to you, you silence them. And what about Black children? Are they not being harmed or made? This is another Black parent who she's on YouTube because she's not in the news, but she's complaining about an incident where her child was made to feel ashamed of being Black at school. We don't see this picture in the media. This is a multiracial coalition in South Carolina led by the ACLU that is fighting against the attack on critical race theory, or the so-called attack on critical race theory. As you can see, here's where the brown people are. All right. Now, this is a quick snapshot. I hope you can see it. I pulled off, you can tell I'm retired because I didn't bother to edit out the other side of the screen. But these are just some of the things that happened to Black children during Black History Month, right? I didn't explore all the ways that Black children are made to feel bad about themselves in school, including physical touching by the teachers, cutting their hair, etc. But this is just Black History Month. And here's a sample of the things that have happened to Black children in public schools during Black History Month. Teacher investigated for telling students to act as slaves. That's New Jersey. Black teens say teacher told them to pick cotton, teach us how slaves were. Mock slave auctions. Virginia students told to be slaves. Tennessee school asked students to make lists of expectations for their slaves. You know, on it goes, all the way across the country, California, as well as states throughout the South. This is not a problem that just exists in the southern states. Racism exists throughout the country. And the question is, why aren't we concerned about these children being ashamed or feeling ashamed or being afraid of what's going on in school? This was a class assignment where the students were told to make posters about slavery. And as you can see, their wanted list for escaped slaves, it's an auction, etc. These are the kinds of things that Black children are being exposed to in the public school system. This is actually one of the little kids who was the subject of this. And this little boy, who was 6 years old, was made to clean feces out of the toilet with his hands by his school teacher. So these are the types of things that are happening to Black kids in school. It's not an imaginary feeling bad. This is real. All right, so we're gonna get to this slide in a second. The fact of the matter is that white parents and politicians see no hypocrisy holding a sign that says we will not be silent, and at the same time silencing the voices of Black parents and children. It's not the right of Black parents and children to be protected. It's only the right of white parents under their First Amendment rights that need to be protected. And that's because there's in many Americans, there's a subconscious separation between their rights and the rights of others. And I think we saw this demonstrated recently when Senator Mitch McConnell himself revealed his cultural unconscious distinction between the voting rights of Americans and Black Americans. When he was preparing to guide the senators to vote against the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is trying to attempt to restore voting protections for Black people, he was asked by the press whether he was concerned about that. And he says, well, the concern, quote, the concern is misplaced because if you look at the statistics, African-American voters are voting in just as high a percentage as Americans. Now, of course, everyone interpreted that to mean that Mitch McConnell thought African-Americans were not the same thing as Americans. He later argued that the words were taken out of context, but there really is no other context. Subconsciously, he is thinking about American voters and African-American voters as something different, because he could have just as easily said African-American voters are voting in just as high percentage as other Americans, but he didn't say that. And again, that may be a subconscious indication that he sees these people as separate and apart. So bringing it back to speech context so we can wrap it up. Let's take a look at what's happening with the restrictions against speech once the race legislation is, critical race legislation is permitted. In all states that passed anti-critical race theory legislation, school districts began to target books for banning. At least initially, the books were supposed to be about race, teaching children hate, or being divisive. Many states gave parents the right to object to the content of books in their children's schools so they could be targeted for banning. Texas started off with a list of 850 books. The list was 16 pages long, but they eventually took action on 86 books in this one region of Texas that includes Austin. NBC gave us the list of the 50 books. This is the photo that you're looking at. And I want to ask you right quick, just to think to yourself, how many of those 50 books were about race? Just write it down on a little note on your paper so that when I get to it, you'll know whether you were right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many were about race? Okay. It might surprise you to learn that only 15 of the 50 books were about race. And that 15 included a children's book about the early life of Olympian Wilma Rudolph's experience growing up in Tennessee. A parent objected to the book because it talked about prejudice that she experienced growing up in Tennessee. A children's book about Michelle Obama was listed on the list because reading about her would make white girls feel ashamed. So I don't know what white girls are doing that they would feel ashamed reading about Michelle Obama, but evidently it's serious. And in Tennessee, not outside of Texas, parents objected to a book about Ruby Bridges, who had to walk past loud and threatening white parents as she tried to integrate a school in New Orleans. Norman Rockwell, the great painter of Americana, painted a picture of this scene of her being escorted by the police. But this is a photo from Black Women's Health Initiative this year. It says, if this child was strong enough to survive it, meaning this situation she was living through, your child is strong enough to learn about it. And that's the Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby. 2 books on the list discuss the experiences of Jewish children under Nazi regimes. The parents objected because the stories were biased. And I'm sure you all know that a school district in Tennessee banned the graphic novel Mouse, which is about the Holocaust. This leaves us with 33 objectionable books. 19 of the 33 were about children who were bisexual, transgender, or gay. And the other 14 involved stories of teens who were becoming aware of the changes in their body brought on by puberty. In other words, there was an awakening of their awareness of their sexuality. Book banning is one of the oldest forms of restriction on speech. It's not surprising then that the literary organization PEN has come out in opposition to these anti-CRT bills. They understand the connection between the attack on CRT and the attack on speech. When CRT legislation in Florida was being passed, did any of you think to ask yourselves, is this the beginning of restriction of speech? Or were you just thinking, oh, this is just about race? If you did not ask if this was the beginning of the attack on speech, were you then surprised when the governor prohibited teachers from saying the word gay in class? You see, that's the price we all pay when constitutional rights advocates decide attacks on race don't concern you, because they aren't attacks on speech. They are attacks on speech, and the anti-CRT legislation is the foot in the door to allow for a broader, more wide-scale attack on any speech that extremist groups dislike. And when I use the word extremist here, I'm talking about right-wing conservative Christians, I'm talking about white supremacists, and I'm talking about anybody else who wants rights for themselves, but not for the people they don't like. The slide towards broad restrictions on the right to speak is quick. You'll remember that shortly after the Texas attack on so-called critical race theory, a school district forbade teaching on the Holocaust unless the opposing side was mentioned. And I ask you as a closing question, what could be the opposing side to teaching that it's wrong to kill 6 million Jewish people? These are the dangers to all speech when we create a silo that in effect protects the right to speech when it supports our speech only and not when it supports the speech of folks of color. It hurts us all in the end. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Lots to talk about and really informative. And I know we will have some interesting questions. So, as I mentioned earlier, you can raise your hand electronically or type a question in chat. I'm going to check chat now. And raise your hand electronically. You can unmute yourself. Elliot Simon, unmute yourself.
Yes.
Question.
Hi, yes. I have a question about the banning of certain books. If I'm not mistaken, the book Mouse was banned for a specific age that they didn't feel was age appropriate. And I've read that book, and I don't know that it was age appropriate for an 8th grader, which I think is about 12 or 13 years old. So I think that some of these books that are banned because parents perhaps don't feel that they're age appropriate. And that may be also the case with books that have to deal with sexuality. And I don't think I'm mistaken, but people even talk about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, that only has to do with conversations between kindergarten and 3rd grade. And it doesn't prohibit discussions of sexuality above those grades. So I think that I'd like to hear from the speaker about age appropriateness as far as some of these banning of books.
Okay. Who is the determinant of what is age appropriate? Should you be able to determine for my child what is age appropriate if I've already agreed to allow my child to see that content? Why do you as a parent have the right to tell me what my child can see? You see, that's the problem. There are other ways. If people are concerned with the age appropriateness of the book Mouse, which is a graphical novel, there are other ways to create solutions for parents who don't want that available to their children without banning it for the parents whose child can read it. Also, just for the record, the objection to Mouse had to do with a nudity issue. And so the author of the graphic novel said, if nudity is the problem, there's ways that you can address that without banning the book. You see that, remember when I said there have to be alternative ways to get the message out and that the restriction has to be narrowly drawn. And that's a great example of how that is not narrowly drawn and there are no other alternatives to get the message out. And let me just say this about the gay issue. There are children in K-3 who are gay. That's a fact, right? That's not someone's opinion. That's a medical fact that the Pediatrics Association has already verified. Yes. So for those children who are gay, K-3, why should their experiences be excluded? If parents have objections of that nature, send your child to a religious school.
Why should it even be discussed in K through 3?
Because there are K through 3 kids
But-
who are gay,
but-
and maybe
but
they
so
have
what?
questions
It doesn't
about
matter.
themselves.
I don't think it matters that they're
It
gay.
doesn't matter what you think. It matters whether you have the right to
No.
restrict what other people.
We've always
can do.
restricted people. We don't allow, we didn't allow people to buy Playboy for certain ages. There's,
And that was overturned, right?
what about the
So,
movies?
you know,
We restricted
we're not going to get into a back and forth on
Right.
it because
Okay.
there are other hands up. But
Right.
clearly, the question is not whether you think the material is offensive, but whether or not your decision impacts the rights of other people who want to see
Well,
it.
it's-
Okay, Shirley, you have a question.
Yes, this is very great. I really appreciate your presenting this to us, but I still need some help.
Sure.
If someone stops you or me on the street and says, "What do you think about teaching the critical race theory?" Do I talk about the laws? Do I talk about what they're trying to prevent? How do I elevator speech this? How do I give a response that makes sense?
Okay, that's a great question. Critical race theory is only taught in law school.
But that doesn't convey the
Wait,
message of what.
Wait,
critical
wait.
race
I'm gonna
theory
get to
is
the message.
Okay.
So if they're concerned about a 12-year-old learning critical race theory, they should actually put that kid on TV because it's a genius. He's a 12-year-old in law school, right? It's also taught in some upper levels of college, but critical race theory is not taught K through 12, and it's not about teaching hate, and it's not about trying to make people feel bad about themselves. Critical race theory is the study of law. Now, what they are really objecting to, and you can put it in the form of a question. Are you objecting to the discussion of race in American history? Right? Because if that is the objection that they're willing to acknowledge, then you already have the tools to address that question, right? You can talk about why it's important to include the histories of all people who are in the United States in the teaching of history, right? You don't have to fall into the trap of trying to defend critical race theory because critical race theory is not being taught K through 12. There's no school district in the country where critical race theory is being taught. So the task for you is to get to what is the root objection that the person has about the teaching. And then you can help educate them. It's not being taught in K through 12. And if your concern is about teaching race, right, let's talk about that, right? It is difficult to talk about race. It produces anxiety in white people, right? It does. But you know what? That's okay. It's a difficult problem. It took centuries to develop, and it's not going to go away by taking a pen and signing a piece of paper. There are difficult conversations that have to be had about race, and we can't escape that by just saying we're going to ban the discussion of it. So hopefully that will help you. My suggestion is get to the root of what they object to and address that.
Right. Rick Gold has a question.
Right. Thank you so much for emphasizing that the discussions about criticism race theory is just a straw man for concerns about race in our society. I'd also add that another straw man is the concept of age appropriateness. But around the world, we're seeing backsliding in democratic advancement, and particularly in the form of liberal democracy, which allows that all people are equal. We here who are strongly committed to free speech have to deal with this backtracking that includes constraints on speech. And it's very difficult. Our weapons is more free speech, but when the law is there saying that we need to be silent, how do we deal with these types of measures?
Yeah, you have to educate your electorate. I mean, there's just no getting around that. It's the electorate that allows these things to happen. And former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was so disturbed by the lack of civic awareness in America today, before she passed, that she started an organization that was dedicated to civic education, right? Those of you who are like my age, I'm going to be 68 this year, we learned civics in school, but that is not a feature in school curriculums anymore. People don't really, even in the law school, people don't understand civics, right? A student could say to me, oh, Obama spent the money. And I'm like, no, separation of powers. It's Congress that spends the money, right? And this was a law student who didn't know about separation of powers. So I think we do have to be more educated. I think we do have to allow speech. When Richard Spencer came to the University of Florida after the Charlottesville killing, there was a big protest. People didn't want him to be able to speak. I said, no, let him speak. Let him speak. It's speech. He should be able to speak. I said, now what we did in the old days, in the olden days, as my students call it, when someone objectionable came to campus to speak, we had to teach him. We didn't tell people, don't make the people speak. We said, okay, while they speak this horrible, objectionable material, we're going to be teaching you over here about what the truth of the issue is, right? So you can choose. You can choose to go hear Richard Spencer, or you can choose to come to the teaching. And I actually convinced members of my faculty, not many, but a few, to have a teaching when Richard Spencer came to campus. And you know what? It was successful. Kids came. More kids came to the teaching than went to see Richard Spencer speak, right? So it's up to us. It's up to us. And in my own personal theory, I have no evidence to support it. I haven't done any studies on it. I think when the US slides into autocratic behavior, it sends a signal to the rest of the world that it's okay to do the same. And you see, every time we have a regime that stops paying attention to rights, it spreads out like a fire through the rest of the world. And other leaders take their cue from that and say, oh, well, if the US doesn't think that's important, we don't think it's either. And they start attacking democracy. So whether you like the US or not, or whether you like our policies or not, we have to be the leader on upholding democracy. Otherwise, the world will slide into darkness. And that's just my personal belief.
Okay, June, Gerard has a question.
Hello, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to mention a long time ago, I interviewed Judy Blume, who wrote the book, Hello, God, It's Me, Margaret. It was about girls' sexuality, and it probably was the first book banned in America because of that. It also became the most popular book. Now, I want to move on to an excerpt that I'm going to read to you from someone who, I won't say that part first. I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll tell you who it was.
Yeah.
Okay. Critical race theory is an academic discipline formulated in the 1990s and built on the intellectual framework of identity-based Marxism, or neo-Marxism, okay?
Right.
There are a series of euphemisms deployed by its supporters to describe critical race theory, including equity, social justice, diversity, and culturally responsive teaching. Critical race theorists, masters of language construction, realize that neo-Marxism would be a hard sell. So equity, on the other hand, sounds non-threatening and is easily confused with the American principle of equality. But the distinction is vast and important, and the principle proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, defended in the Civil War, and codified into law with the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is explicitly rejected by critical race theorists. To them, equality represents mere non-discrimination and provides camouflage for white supremacy, patriarchy, and oppression.
Okay, so we're for white supremacy.
Yes, That's it.
That's pretty funny. That's pretty funny. First of all, it's factually incorrect. Critical race theory started in 1978. It's been going for 40 years without notice and without anyone complaining. The Marxist stuff and all that, that's actually critical legal studies. That was the white guys I told you about in the beginning of my talk. That was
Right.
critical legal studies. It has nothing to do with critical race theory. It's just one of the 5 critical jurisprudence. So, you know, everything in that is false. Yeah.
Interesting because it comes from a highly educated person.
Oh, I'm sure it does, but they're just, people can be highly educated and ignorant about particular issues.
Yes.
There's nothing contradictory about that. I'm a
but-
highly educated person, but I know nothing about heart surgery. I'm ignorant as to heart surgery, right? So if you have a heart ailment, don't come to me and ask me for help. I am ignorant as to that.
It was a lecture delivered to Hillsdale College.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. We'll get to Jordan and Don, and then we have a question or two from the chat as well.
I'll
George.
stay here as long as you need me to answer questions.
Oh, thank you so
open to
much.
that, yeah.
We'll aim by a quarter after we'll finish.
It doesn't
And
matter.
if you have to leave.
No,
don't
I
have
have
to
no
ask-
appointments today. If folks have to
Right.
leave. But if you still have questions, I'm happy to stay here and answer.
Okay, good. Jordan.
Two things, actually. First of all, as far as talking about gay people to really young children in school, there are, I know a lot of gay couples that have children in school. And one of the things that you do when kids are kind of getting introduced, you talk about your family. So that right there is really reason why that discussion should be allowed. And my other question is, if a teacher is teaching history and they start talking about the Black Seminoles or the Trail of Tears or lynchings in that, are these parents going to be able to sue them, the teacher, for making their children feel bad? I mean, this is such a slippery slope about what teachers are going to be able to teach as far as history.
That's absolutely right, right? And in some states, the parents have been empowered to actually complain and bring disciplinary action and lawsuits against the teachers. So, and let's just show how slippery that is. Thomas Jefferson wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And in the book, he discusses the conflicting ideas about slavery. And he also makes many racist statements himself. Are we not able to talk about Notes on the State of Virginia? A classic look at American history in the formation of the state government in Virginia. Are we not able to do that? Would we not be allowed to talk about, we're always allowed to talk about Abraham Lincoln, but you never hear teachers talk about the letter Abraham Lincoln wrote to Douglas where he says, look, I don't care anything about slavery. My focus is the Union. And he says in that letter, which is published and available, if I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could preserve the Union by freeing some and keeping others enslaved, I would do that, because my purpose is to preserve the Union. It's not about slavery, right? And that's the great emancipator that we're all talking about, or we're all taught about. So, there's so many aspects of American history that wouldn't be able to be discussed if we went to the extreme of what these legislative initiatives are trying to accomplish.
Very good. Don Fields, you have to unmute yourself. Figure that out.
Click yeah, there we go.
I'm here, finally. Couldn't find my mouse arrow. I want the important thing to me is in educating the electorate and citizens at large. And I think to do that, we need a polished message that is clear, easily understood, and avoids confusion. And we have to incite passion about getting to the truth. And I do, and one of the ways to do that is to focus group it, to see how the message plays in the general public. And I know that's what Charles Koch and his organizations do. They do polish it using focus groups.
Yes, absolutely.
Like Frank Luntz and Words That Work. I mean, it's specifically targeted there. And in my suggestion, I don't see anyone doing that to counteract the messages that we get from those who would shorten history and obscure the truth, or not be able to face it themselves, whatever that large class is, which is a lot of us, 63 million people who voted.
So people are doing that. Unfortunately, how would you hear about it? Right? So that's the question. How would you hear about it? That kind of work that you're talking about needs to happen through the action of groups like Florida ACLU. They're the ones who have the kind of outreach and the ability to do that kind of focus group things. The Black community is doing the focus. We're doing those discussions. We've got material online for people to look at that give the clear message, right? The legal organizations like the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, many of the Black organizations have that material available and out there, but it's not us that the white community wants to listen to. It's you all. So to me, I was quite disappointed when I went on Florida ACLU's website and I saw that the only thing at the time I went up, which was about 2 weeks ago, I'll admit, the only thing I saw up there on criticizing DeSantis' approach to critical race theory was a student project they had posted on the site. Right? Where are the lawyers in Florida that do First Amendment or civil rights work? Where are you? Where are they? Why isn't the community going out there and doing that work, that exact same work that you're talking about? Because that has to come from white people.
Yeah.
And see, that's the problem. That's the problem. It's hard work, and even liberal and progressive whites get social justice fatigue. They can get up and work for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, but after that, they're like, are we still talking about race? Yes. We've been talking about it for 400 years. If you think you're tired after 90 days, think about how tired I am.
Yeah.
Brown versus Board of Ed was decided when I was born, the year I was born. I was 13 years old before schools in the United States desegregated. Right? And today they're more segregated than they were before Brown was decided. So tell me about being tired. It's the white community. It's the liberal, progressive, educated white community that has to do the very work that you're talking about. So I invite you to start doing that work.
A couple of more questions. Dorothy has had her hand up for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to stick her in right now. And unmute. Yes, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I have two quick questions. I'll just ask them and then not comment beyond them. One, how does it advance free speech to open your presentation with a video that mocks a man who, though not as educated as you, should be allowed to express his views without drawing ridicule?
I was not mocking him.
Just let me finish.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. And
but you started on an incorrect premise. And so, but go ahead, finish, and then I'll clean it up.
You do that. And if people of color are still oppressed in this country, economically, legally, and socially, how have you enjoyed so stellar a career? Thank you.
Yeah, those are two great questions. First of all, it wasn't a mock. And the fact that you took it as a mock is interesting to me because it shows that you have some tenderness on there. I showed it to show you how voters are exercising their constitutional right to vote based on ignorance. Right? That's the message that you should take from
So
that.
you were calling that man ignorant.
He is ignorant.
Okay.
He said he was ignorant. I don't have to make that judgment. He said it in the tape. He did not understand what the issue was, but he was going to vote against it. That didn't come out of my mouth. That was from him. It's not a mock of him. It's an example of how whites who are ignorant about certain issues will go ahead and vote on very critical issues that concern people of other communities. Now, let me speak to your second question, because this is a common question that people who don't believe that there's inequality in the United States will ask. Well, you made it, right? Me, the exceptional Black person, made it all right. You have no idea what my history was or what my family went through in order to get to where we are, right? You have no idea. So your assumption that because I got an education means that there's no discrimination is completely false. And what you can do to help yourself is look at the scientific and the factual data that exist on the extent of discrimination in the United States. I don't engage in back and forth arguments or arguments with people like you because you do not know the data that supports my decades worth of learning. When you get out and look at the data and educate yourself about what it says about racism and discrimination in the United States, then we can have a discussion. But even as a lawyer or a law professor, I experience racial discrimination every day. I've had to sue students. I've had to bring criminal complaints against students. I've had students threaten to kill me, right? This is the reality of Black people in America, whether they're professionals or not. So your inability to see what my life experience is says nothing to me about whether racism exists. So I heartily encourage you to educate yourself. And you can start with Robin DiAngelo. She's a white woman. She wrote a book called White Fragility. And Robin has devoted her energies to helping white people understand what racism is and how they participate in it. So I heartily recommend that to you, Robin DiAngelo, D-I-A-N-G-E-L-O,
I'm familiar with
White Fragility.
Okay, very good. I will make a distinction. I think it's important to distinguish ignorance from stupidity.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think that's an important thing.
Absolutely.
Horace, the two questions on the chat.
Yeah, I saw something in the chat.
Both had to do with what Masuma says, would you say that there is confusion in de jure prescriptions and de facto cultural beliefs? How can this be addressed or clarified, if at all?
Okay, so.
And the other question, I think it's similar, is there is such a, from Norma Green, there is such a contradiction about truth. How do we talk about CRT? Both of them have to do with how we grasp, how do we deal with it?
Right. Both great questions. Again, so part of the problem with the whole CRT thing, as I introduced in the beginning, is that it's about legal principles, right? De facto and de jure are issues that apply to law. And so it's hard to get a layperson to wrap their hands around what that actually means. But many people now believe that since the law prohibits you from saying, I will not hire Blacks at my company, that means that you're banned from hiring Blacks at your company. But that's not true. The law in the United States doesn't prohibit racism. We've never had a law that prohibited racism. What our law prohibits is you cannot be a government official and engage in racist behavior. That is, the state or the federal government cannot engage in racist behavior. But you as an individual have a private right to be racist. That has always been the case in our country. It is not like that in other pieces of the world, right? Like in Europe, you can't promote Nazism, or you can't be a Holocaust denier because that's actually against the law. There are criminal sanctions for that. We don't have that in the United States because we're an individualistic society, right? So you have your individual right to be racist if you want to. It's just that you can't act on that as a federal official. Now let's look at the contradiction of that. If you are in your individual rights a racist, and you have a job in the federal government, how do we keep your personal racist views from influencing how you behave in your government job, you see? But the way the law is structured, unless I can prove that you intentionally wanted to be racist in your job, I have no claim of action if your personal beliefs color something that you do at work. So it's a very hard distinction to make, but we have to start with the fact that in the United States, and we have to accept this and embrace it because it's the law, you do have an individual right to be racist. And that is the law. And so perhaps that will help explain how de facto racism occurs, because it seeps into action based on what the person believes and does on an individual level. So I hope that helps with the question. It's a difficult question, but it has so much to do with where we are legally in the United States in terms of your ability to be racist if you want to, because it's your freedom, right? That's your individual choice to do it.
One last question.
Wait, I got to answer the other question.
From Horace. Well,
Yeah.
I have to get to a meeting
Oh,
myself,
okay.
and I'm recording this. So Horace.
All right, go Horace. And I'll
Thank
stick the other answer
you,
in there.
John.
Yeah.
Professor Jacob, thank you for giving us some extra time. I wholeheartedly agree with you about your opinion about Richard Spencer. When he came here, I tried to get everybody to go watch a movie, go do something else. If you I was this organization's president last year. If you truly believe in free speech is available to everyone.
Agreed.
You do not have to sit in front of a person and hear that BS.
Right.
Go do something else. Teach your family how to be tolerant. Let everybody have their freedom. I'm looking at the Republicans now talking about my freedom. I got the freedom to do this. And I said to myself, I guess all white people are the same. Because Professor Jacobs, what you were really saying is what I said last month's speaker, and I'm going to say it again this month. The silent majority is what is causing democracy to decay in this country.
I agree.
They sit back and they say, this is what should be happening. They're the most educated people in the country, but they don't voice their opinions. Critical race theory was not at the University of Florida when I graduated in 1980. I've been practicing law for 42 years. And I have learned in my Black community, you know what? Sometimes you may know too much and it does you no good to talk about it because the people that you're talking to, they're not going to understand it.
So
in American legal history, to me, that is probably one of the most difficult classes that a law student could probably take and try to get an A out of it.
But we don't teach it anymore. It's an elective. But let me speak to and you know what, John, if you can have Nancy send you her question, if you email it to me, I'll send her an answer.
Okay.
Right? Her hand has been up for a long time and I want her question to be answered. But let me just say this in response to Horace and to close it out. This all has to do with the previous question about truth, right? About the contestation of what is truth. So we're at this period of time where now, if I say water is H2O, somebody's gonna say it's not. Now, science tells us H2O is water. I can't keep somebody from saying it's not, right? This is a person who doesn't believe in science. H2O is water. You can do it 10 times. If you put those molecules together, you're gonna get water. You can do it 1,000 times, you're gonna get water. If somebody says it's not, okay, that's your belief. However, I'm not going to spend time debating with you that H2O is water. I'm not going to do that because it's not useful. So what I would say for people who are worried about truth, you know, these things, and it's going to sound strange coming from me, but these things have to be handled one person at a time. You have to be in your community with the people that you have relationships with, even if they don't agree with you, and be able to be in a safe space where you can have a conversation with them and maybe do the demonstration with the two molecules of helium, hydrogen and the one of oxygen, and put it together and say, see, here's water. You know, and maybe it takes that. But to me, I think that progress will only come when white Americans who believe in truth or value it are willing to talk to their family members, their friends, their neighbors about what truth is and how you arrive at truth and how you test information to see if it's true, right? The Civil War happened. You can't unmake that. It's over. It happened, it was written about, and it's in the books. Now, you might argue about why it happened, but the fact that it happened can't be debated. So I think we have to start reaching for those kinds of truths that can't be debated, right? Because they happened and they exist. And if we do that community by community, and then get like-minded communities to do what Horace is saying is speak out loud. I'm sorry I wasn't at Florida when you came through, but your son was there when I was teaching critical race theory. So, you know, the people who believe in democracy have to start speaking out. You cannot be silent just because you think the thing is about race. It's not just about race. It's about anti-Semitism. It's about homophobic views. It's about anti-immigrant attacks. It's all connected to who has the right to speak and who doesn't, right? And we have to fight for everyone's right to speak, not just white people who want to be offensive. And so that's it. If you have some other questions, please email them to me. I want to make sure your community is informed, and I want to answer whatever questions you all have that you couldn't get to today, okay?
Well, I want to thank you very much.
So much for hanging in there. You've been a great audience.
Good. Let me just tell everybody that we're asking you to join us virtually for the next meeting of the Florida Free Speech Forum, which is on Monday, April 11th. Our guest speaker or speakers are the winners of the University of Florida's Breckner Center Freedom of Information Award for 2022. We don't know who they are yet, and we will tell you about them when we give notice of the next meeting on the Tuesday previous to April 11th.
Okay, well, email me because you know I'm retired and my schedule is way busy now that I'm retired.
Can we have her email address? Can we have Dr.?
We do.
Yeah.
Paul has it. I have it too.
Yeah, you can even reach me at the law school.
So thank everybody for joining today. Stay safe. And the Florida Free Speech Forum now is adjourned, and I'll get to my other meeting. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, Joe. Bye, Horace.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's see if I can get out of this situation. Okay.